With me today are two panelists with deep knowledge in this field. Karine Erasmus is an experienced sustainability and climate change specialist and advisor. Of interest has been her work in climate change vulnerability and risk assessments for the mining industry, with a focus on surrounding communities. Karine holds a master's in philosophy in development practice from the University of Pretoria and is a South African Institute for Chartered Accountants Sustainability Technical Committee member. She is also currently Associate Director and Sustainability Lead at BDO South Africa, an international network of tax, accounting, and business advisory firms. Also with us is Belinda Petrie, CEO of One World Sustainable Investments. Described as a rare mixture of entrepreneur and human compassion, Belinda has been at the forefront of renewable energy implementation and social transition across Africa for many years. Recently, she has facilitated the Social Dialogue series on the just energy transition for the South African Presidential Climate Commission, an exercise that engaged with communities and economic sectors across South Africa that are most likely to be impacted by the climate change transition. So Belinda, I'd like to start with you. The International Energy Agency, in its roadmap for net zero emissions by 2050, states that millions of new jobs can be created by clean energy investments that will also boost global economic growth. Yet it juxtaposes this by stating that from today, no investment in new fossil fuel supply projects and no further final investment decisions for new unabated coal plants can take place. By 2035, there can be no sales of new internal combustion engine passenger cars. These are major economic sectors and drivers of employment in many countries. So please help us understand exactly what is a just transition.
Alex, thanks for that introduction. I'm actually coming at this not only from a just energy transition perspective, but there are many countries like South Africa that have to both mitigate carbon emissions and adapt to the impacts of climate change. And both of them affect the transition and need to be done in a just way. So you're asking, what does that mean? Putting it simply, it's a range of social interventions that are needed to make sure that the rights of both workers and communities and their livelihoods are protected in that transition. So you talk about, no more fossil fuels after X date. That obviously affects coal mining, for example, or oil industries around the world. It affects their people that are working directly in those jobs, and it affects the communities that are supporting say, economic corridors around coal mining belts, for example, in Mpumalanga. So it's not directly only about the workers, although the just transition concept was born out of the trade union in the 1950s, out of that movement. So it was very much in those days about protecting the rights of workers directly, but that's broadened to look at livelihoods and communities as well. And it also bears in mind that a worker might multiply income and support for 5 people or 7 people or 3 people, but it's not just the worker themselves. So I think that's important to remember. So those social interventions, certainly in the Presidential Climate Commission's mind in this country, as is the case with many just transition processes around the world, it's also about, in addition to protecting the rights, it's also about maximizing the social and economic opportunities that emerge out of such transitions. It recognizes that, or it seeks to recognize, I look forward to Karine's response just now, but it seeks to recognize that there are opportunities and that this is all, this is not all doom and gloom, but those opportunities can only be maximized if we plan for them. So, a just transition in Norway with an oil industry might look very different to a just transition in South Africa with a coal industry, where South Africa is the most unequal society in the world, and Norway is probably the opposite, which is why I chose those two. And so the just transition will look different in these two different countries. And I think that's also important to understand. But in essence, this is about making sure that the rights of people that have been the sort of center of fossil fuel industries, in your example, that their rights are not lost in the process of transitioning to a different energy-based economy. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, no, thank you very much. And I think we'll touch base on those issues of opportunities and also geographic fragmentation a little later with a bit of luck. Karine, I'm going to throw you in right into the deep end here. I'm going to ask you the fundamental question. We talk about a just transition. Is there such a thing? Can a transition like this that we are facing at the moment ever really truly be just?
Thanks, Alex. Good afternoon. I think Belinda has touched on that concept in two ways. Firstly, a just transition will look very different, so that how we define just will look very different here in South Africa, in Southeast Asia, to what it perhaps does in Europe. And that's very much the starting point. The second thing is, what we should ask ourselves critically is, we're talking about a just energy transition, but are the societies or our communities, using the South African example, are they living within a just socioeconomic context at the moment? And in that respect, it's not so much about the energy transition being just, but it is about our socioeconomic development being just and enabling a much larger energy transition to take place. And in that respect, I wanted to touch on two things that Belinda mentioned. The first is that when we look at communities being affected, when we look at things like climate change at a national or at a regional level, one of the key elements in this transition is to start decoupling only the mitigation and the energy part from other climate-related impacts. We need to start bringing climate adaptation to the forefront, particularly in vulnerable areas. So from a just perspective, our focus cannot be isolated on an energy transition. It needs to incorporate regional, large-scale economic change, which is going to happen as a result of climate. The second component is related to how we look at the just energy transition. Certainly in South Africa, there's an emotive connection to the coal industry, and understandably so. And we need to change that narrative to not only talking about the risks or the potential major social impacts, but by looking at opportunities. And changing that narrative is about finding opportunities, as Belinda rightly said, maximizing those opportunities and bringing those to the forefront. Can there be a just energy transition? One certainly hopes so, but that is dependent on different regions. It is dependent on the socioeconomic fabric within which that transition needs to take place. And it is certainly dependent on the will of strategic decision makers in changing, alleviating, and uplifting that social fabric to enable such a transition.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Karine. I just want to say we are, a lot of participants are joining this webinar. I would just like to please encourage everyone to put questions into the chat group. We will pick up on those. We always get very rich discussion and debate coming in from our online participants. So please do that, and we will try our very best to address those issues that you bring to the fore. Karine, you raise a really interesting point about the fact that actually from a baseline level, perhaps we're not in a just socioeconomic environment anyway in the first place. So the idea of a just transition is perhaps we should be focusing much more on the opportunities. But Belinda, if I can come back to you, in terms of precedents of what we're facing at the moment, you spoke about trade union movement back in the 1950s. Can you just give us a sense of whether society, and particularly global society, has ever faced anything like this before, and how it was addressed?
Alex, you've heard about the Industrial Revolution, right?
I've heard about that, yes, a long time ago.
So there's your answer. Yeah, I mean, you know that we've been through that. I mean, it is the Industrial Revolution. So, I mean, I'm being facetious and I'm not. The Industrial Revolution is what's got us to where we are today, with this need to transition and reduce greenhouse gas emissions at an urgent rate. But there's been, really interesting work and discussion going on that we're now in the fifth wave of an industrial revolution and moving towards a green economy. I think that the world has experienced transitions. I think they're different. I mean, one could bring up COVID. Was that a transition? And hopefully it was a temporary, but long temporary aberration, and not necessarily a full transition, but this is a full transition. And I think the best example is the Industrial Revolution, which threw us into a completely different framework and was completely transformative in terms of the change. And that's what we are facing now. I think it will happen. Not I think it will happen. Let me rephrase that. It is happening. So we can either wake up and go along with it and plan for it and preempt and be proactive, or we can sit around passively, as I'm sure some did in the Industrial Revolution, and let it take us over. But that is the kind of transition that I think we are in at the moment.
Yeah. Your thoughts on that, Karine? I mean, it's perhaps the biggest difference, of course, is the scale. We're now talking about a global transition here. How does that impact different parts of the country, different parts of the world? Both of you have mentioned that a just transition is going to look very different in different parts of the world. Can you give us some examples?
Sure. So just on your first part of the question, I think the Industrial Revolution is an excellent example to equate this to. It's interesting, and it comes back to the initial point around opportunities. The Industrial Revolution was called a revolution, and there was this propelling forward into significant economic growth. And when we talk energy transition, we use the word transition, which is generally a safer, a more conservative sounding word. And that, I think, also prohibits us talking about the fact that there are a myriad of opportunities, economic opportunities contained within this transition. It's not a moving back from something to something else. It is a revolution in its own sense. And if we think about how these two are juxtaposed, it's interesting that we're not looking at this from a revolutionary perspective. That sounds much more anarchistic, is what I meant it to sound, but it certainly is it is a good example. It's the right example, the Industrial Revolution. But it's just interesting how we change the semantics around that and the impact that those semantics would have on the discussion. In terms of how it looks different regionally, I attended a practical example. I attended the mining Indaba earlier this year, and also had a discussion around the just energy transition. And some of my fellow panelists were from the UK. And one of them, literally 5 minutes before we stepped onto the floor, asked and said, why do you put the word just in there? We just talk about an energy transition. Okay. And I think that is a good example of how this looks in different regions of the world. The concept of a just transition is socially and socioeconomically interlinked with different geographic areas. And where it might simply be an energy transition in certain parts of the world, where it might simply be, to use Belinda's example, an energy transition in Norway, the social implications of that for a developing country, a developing economy, is very different. So we have many social connections in terms of energy poverty. One of the questions is, how do we manage this within our current energy crisis? So we have competing socioeconomic components that we need to address as part of only an energy transition. And it's easier elsewhere, but here it's a bit more complex because of those socioeconomic aspects.
You've often used the word energy poverty, or the phrase energy poverty. What do you mean by that, and how does that play itself out in this transition?
I would really like to be credited with using the phrase energy poverty, Alex, but I'll get back to you on who coined it.
Okay.
But it's so energy poverty is a lack in a very small nutshell. It's a lack of access to energy and energy resources, but it's a lack of access to energy, to electricity, and particularly formal electricity, safe electricity systems. That's particularly relevant when we talk about countries or when we talk about Africa, for example. Access to energy is one thing. Access to formal, integrated, safe energy systems is something quite different. But in a nutshell, that's the fundamental of it. And what we mean by energy poverty is people that do not have access to these systems, to electricity, and that is a major prohibitor in terms of socioeconomic development. And
perhaps that plays itself out in the developed world in terms of access to energy, yes, but increasing costs that is being experienced at the moment. Belinda, I want to come to you because perhaps this came out in the social dialogue process that you've been involved with. But earlier, both of you spoke to me about the issue of the role women play in the transition, and also very particularly issues of health and how that will impact going forward. Would you like to touch on either or both of those issues?
Alex, I'm going to touch on both, and I'm going to build on the discussion that you and Karine have been having on energy poverty to do that. So, I mean, energy poverty, you know, perhaps just to go back a step and say that this is a massive issue in a country that's had an abundance of coal and an abundance of coal-fired power generation. And yet we've got so many people sitting in energy poverty. So I think we just need to sit up and think about that as a frame for this whole discussion, and how any of us, our participants, and ourselves walk out of this meeting and go forward. I also just wanted to say that in that regard, the Industrial Revolution, I don't think the word revolution was used at the time of the Industrial Revolution happening. I think that came, you know, when we talked about it historically. So, but the anarchy or anarchical element was there, and I would hope to see a similar anarchical element in what we are busy with at the moment. Because it's critical. So to go back to women and the health issues, and what you're asking about, Alex, is that, and also remembering that you have got, like it or not, two panelists that are talking about these issues, that are addressing them in South Africa, one of the most unequal societies in the world. So you talk about women, we're dealing with women that have, you know, are still not gender mainstreamed, as people like to call it. It also impacts children. So I think I might have mentioned before some work that we've been doing with UNICEF, which is the United Nations Children Foundation, the health issues from respiratory diseases that come from fossil fuel burning, whether that's kerosene, paraffin, just good old biomass or coal, are immense, and they are twice as huge for a child whose lungs, etc., are not yet developed than they are for an adult. But they leave that child, so they're twice as difficult to combat with a child, those kinds of respiratory issues. But they also then are compounded by that child's future health development being compromised. So those kids end up maybe not with long-term respiratory disease, but they end up prone to cancer, prone to cardiovascular diseases as adults. So it lives with them forever. I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I think that, this also goes back to the discussion around this is not just a just energy transition. Even in Norway, it would not just be a just energy transition because Norway sells that oil to other parts of the world and it pollutes in other parts of the world and it causes health issues in other parts of the world. So I know it also ties up with your regional versus, I don't know what the word is, but it's not a disaggregated issue. I don't think it's as simple as that. But the context in which you are looking at the transition is different, as we've both said earlier. So, the thing about children and their diseases is that's also intrinsically tied up with women because they're often the ones that are looking after the kids. They give birth to the kids. They give birth sometimes to kids that have got deformities or defects because of what was happening in the fetal stage, because of these kinds of health issues. So, every stage of a child's development from before it's born is affected by health issues. And so it's not for nothing that organizations like the Center for Environmental Rights are fighting court cases in this country, and they're happening around the world around these kinds of issues. So there are penalties or consequences, for want of a better word, for the people that are living through a transition that's not happening and are affected, and for the people that are not changing the game, private and public sector. The other issue with women is that, and this did come up in the social dialogue processes around this issue of energy poverty. Women and children are the worst off, least able to do something about it. Health issues are impacted, as I keep saying. Women have been disempowered from having jobs in a very male-dominated coal mining and power generation industry. And they want to see that looking very different going forward, very, very different. To me, the opportunity in all of this, and I promise I'll stop after this point, the opportunity in all of this for equalizing society is immense. It's an opportunity to go and consciously and deliberately look at the social opportunities that come out of a green economy and make sure that our children, youth, and women are at the forefront of that change.
Okay. I want to come to those points about the opportunities. What are they, and how do we access them? But I just very quickly want to come back to you, Karine, because you've got some very strong points or viewpoints around health and actually feeding into future labor pools. So you speak quite a bit about the need for reskilling and the need for appropriate skills to be available for the renewable energy future that we are going into. But you also have a tremendous worry about about whether we will be able to skill in the first place and whether we will have a healthy labor pool to take up those jobs that are required. Do you want to touch a little bit on that?
Sure, and I think again, Belinda gave a great interlude into that, talking about the health issues and the kind of long-term health issues that people and communities around some of these areas would face in their lifetimes, and that affects them and impacts them in several different ways. We talk about, or my concern stems from, we talk about the just energy transition, and in many cases, it's almost as if we think we're going to switch off coal-fired power stations, and then we're just going to have solar, and that's going to kind of balance out in one way or another. And there are several concerns around that. One, it's just not practically how it's going to play out. There is no comparison between the labor opportunities and the breadth of labor offered through mining and the coal mining industry in relation to, for instance, solar. And one of the key opportunities that I believe South Africa has in the transition is to look at manufacturing and beneficiation of technologies, various technologies, solar, cleaner technologies within the South Africa geographic area, and making sure that we create these different secondary economies through some of those processes. However, this is all going to happen in a couple of years' time. We need to start laying the foundations for that, and then the intention is that there at some stage there will be this transition. However, what we're not doing is thinking about the labor pool that's going to need to drive that transition. And if we think about the provinces affected in the South African case, again, affected by the just energy transition, and Belinda gave me the heads up last week not to just look at Mpumalanga, but if you look at the Northwest, if you look at Limpopo, these are provinces with incredibly low levels of literacy, and particularly incredibly low levels of matriculants who complete or schoolgoers who complete a matric certificate, a grade 12 certificate.
And this could be reflected in other parts of the world as well.
It could absolutely be reflected in other parts of the world. Access to education, there's a whole intersection here. If we use the South African case, what this means is if we look at beneficiation, if we look at solar technologies, these are higher skilled employment, higher skilled jobs that we'll need to create to drive this different economy. Okay. But we are not laying the foundation from a labor pool perspective to achieve that. We're not, from an educational perspective, we're simply not building a labor pool that will be able to manage those types of skills, those types of economies. We talk about reskilling a lot, and again, reskilling is crucial to this, but it cannot be in a responsive manner. It cannot simply be from mining into maintaining a solar plant. We need to think about the secondary economies that will need to start to grow, and then what is the labor pool and what will it look like? What should it look like to sustainably manage and to sustainably roll that out?
Okay, thanks for that, Karine. We're getting some wonderful questions coming in on the chat group here, so I want to get to them fairly quickly. But Belinda, anything you would like to add in terms of the available opportunities that the just transition presents to us? And if so, how do we actually grab onto those opportunities and make them real?
Alex, yeah, again, I'm going to give you both sides of the positive and the negative, because we need to deal with, the planning aspect that I spoke about earlier. So there are plenty of opportunities. It's in the same way as there were with the Industrial Revolution. It changed the world, and for good reason, right? There were new technologies, new skills, new ways of developing economies. I mean, they were just new everything. And in the main, apart from this massive problem it's left us with, this was all socially a very good thing. It spun the world into an era of nobody had ever experienced old age in the way that we're experiencing in society now. I mean, there have been many, many really positive spin-offs that nobody really talks about that much, because we're very focused on the climate crisis, and so we should be. But to me, it's about maximizing those opportunities. And I think that we have to look outside of, sectors, which is also why I get a bit nervous of the just energy transition, because then all people will do is think about one energy job being replaced by another energy job. Okay. But life doesn't work like that, right? Renewable energy doesn't employ as many people as the coal-fired power energy environment has employed, whether that's in China or South Africa or Australia. It just doesn't. And that doesn't mean renewables energy is socially bad. It just means the jobs need to be found elsewhere. So as we're developing new technologies, we're doing research and development, we're thinking about skilling up plumbers to be able to install solar water heaters, because they install geysers, so they understand the water side. Now they also need the electrical side, because they have to be able to connect those systems. So, it's new technologies, they span across different sectors. So I think that's absolutely critical to think about. So one transport job is not necessarily another transport job. One of the examples that I might have spoken about with you before, and this is, I was also very anti just talking about Mpumalanga, but the interesting thing about Mpumalanga is that because it's been so focused on coal mining and coal-fired power generation, It's, as a province, kind of forgotten that it's got some of the most fertile agriculture land in the country. Some of that land has been degraded by mining activities, and much of it hasn't. So it's agriculture opportunities and it's value-added agriculture opportunities, for example. Green hydrogen. Yep. You know, we just don't know where green hydrogen is going to go, but what we do know is that with good, and Karine mentioned localization just now, beneficiation, and thank you. But if we had good localization policy embedded in our industrial development policy, the green hydrogen opportunities that will otherwise be led by the private sector, and should be led by the private sector, can create a massive amount of jobs and can transition jobs away from companies like Sasol, which is the biggest listed company on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange and is an international company that's got the biggest carbon footprint in this country. Plus, it's one of the global 100 carbon emitters. It also employs tens of thousands of people. So, you know, for Sasol to go away from being a dirty company to being a green company, it needs to think about the jobs that it could transition. But Sasol could be a big player in the green hydrogen space. So it's, you know, by being proactive, working with government around the policy issues, the localization, etc., and just taking some responsibility for that, Sasol could change the game in this country.
And
So,
it feels very ironic for some folks that, you know, the energy companies of old, based on fossil fuels, will very likely be the energy companies of the future, harnessing renewable energy prospects. So, you know, that is that goes back to the whole idea of whether this is a just transition or not. But I want to come in with a question from Joseph in Wales, actually, interestingly enough, who talks about the fact that it's well and fine discussing transitional issues, but actual physical climate change issues come to the fore. We are probably not going to reach the goal of global warming being contained to 1.5. Current policies put us way above 2 degrees at the moment, so we've got a long way still to go. There's going to be physical impact. That's going to have its own issues around inequality, etc. And I think what Joseph might be alluding to here is also the rhetoric of policymakers. So both of you have mentioned at the beginning that this just transition, and Belinda purposely didn't put the word energy in there, the just transition is very dependent on astute policymakers. Who are those policymakers? Are we sufficiently confident that we have the right wise minds in the right places at the moment thinking about this? Green, I'm throwing that hot potato at you to get your thoughts on it.
That talk about, you know, putting someone on the spot. That's a tricky one.
Let me put it another way. Are we seeing sufficient leadership globally and nationally around the just transition discussion?
I think there's certainly been a significant change in the narrative for the better over the past couple of years around climate commitments, around ambitions, and so there's certainly been a change in the discussion. There's certainly been a ramp up in terms of what we're doing and what we need to do differently. I do, however, agree with the question, and Belinda also alluded to it earlier, that in terms of driving policy, at the moment there is such a focus on energy, there's such a focus on the mitigation part of climate, and realistically speaking, we might not, you know, we're not going to meet that target. We're not going to meet the 1.5. We need to start very proactively planning for what that then looks like. So, and I think they can be, with the same vigor that we're talking about mitigation, alternative technologies, and, you know, driving down emissions, we need to start talking about how do we get countries, regions, sectors ready for what physical climate change means. A really good example of this in a practical sense is the global standard for mine tailings facilities.
Right.
Actually includes a component now on climate adaptation. And it particularly speaks to how do we model, how do you integrate modeling into your design? What is the timeframes that you're looking at from a design perspective for your tailing storage facilities? What is the monitoring and the disaster readiness that you are building into the design for your tailing storage facilities? So that is the kind of proactive adaptation planning that one would like to see across different sectors, but certainly being driven from an executive top-down perspective in terms of getting ready for these changes and being able to put systems, processes, and actions in place to safeguard, whether it be communities or whether it be particular economic sectors.
Okay. Belinda, do you think we need to be looking for leadership from politicians, or is it technocrats, autocrats, bureaucrats? Is it the negotiators at the different COP meetings? Where are we going to find this guiding light?
Alex, I don't think we're going to find it in one place. So, I think that's first and foremost. Revolutions, either people are part of them or they get trampled by them. So let's not forget that. Whether you're talking about the Industrial Revolution or the Russian Revolution or the French Revolution, that's what happens. Historically, I wish, don't you, that we could have been a fly on the wall in these kinds of discussions during the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, they must have taken place.
They must have taken place. Maybe not in this format, but they definitely must have taken place. So and I often think about it. I think that I think the question more, Alex, is probably who plays what role. So there's a role for everyone, there's no doubt. There's a role for poor communities in terms of pitching up at a meeting and saying their say. And empowering themselves and being empowered to do that. There's a role for the private sector in terms of implementation. There's a role for the public sector in terms of driving a certain type of implementation through policy and guidance. But one can never forget that policy sits with the public sector and implementation by and large sits with the private sector. I think 75% roughly of South Africa's jobs and pretty much anywhere in the world are private sector generated, but they are generated under the auspices of policy, or not. So your question to Karine earlier was, do we have the right leadership? I'm not going to go there. But what I can say and will say, with comfort, is that from an energy perspective, if you take the energy transition as a component of a broader just transition, it can't happen. An energy transition cannot happen without good industrialization policy. Right. And
so the private sector is essential.
So the private sector is essential. The public sector must drive the beneficiation and localization elements. Otherwise, they don't necessarily happen, because the private sector will probably end up going where things happen best. So there is, there's a give and take, but I think policy guides, private sector implements. And so we must never forget that guidance versus implementation role.
So I think,
and we can't make policy in a vacuum. You can't make, Karine and I keep saying this in different ways, but you can't make energy policy in the vacuum of industrialization policy or climate resilience policy.
Absolutely. Okay.
Yeah.
That relationship is so important. I want to touch on this. I want to slightly flip the private sector participation around, because I can see questions from Nomsa and others coming in here, which is really around not just the role that the private sector can play, because I think we've chatted about that and spoken about the opportunities that they can bring to the party, but to what degree do the policymakers place pressure on the private sector and companies who are at the end of the day, perhaps the emitters that are causing these problems in the first place. So from a just transition perspective, how what kind of a stick gets applied to emitting companies? Okay, Corinne, I'll let you go with that one.
I think if we look at the, again, I'm going to use the South African example. We have a carbon taxation policy, which to a large extent was initially defined as a stick. I think there are many carrots that kind of went, and that's part of the stick in terms of, the different thresholds and the different opportunities that companies have to lessen their liability. But I think from a policy perspective, that's been, that's been a stick approach. Do we think that a stick approach is necessarily the right way to go from a private sector buy-in perspective? I'm not sure. I think there is an opportunity that is opened up in terms of dialogue, in terms of conversation, in terms of talking about various different types of opportunities. Around the just transition across various different sectors, and bringing a stick to that fight, to change the analogy somehow, but to bring a stick to that fight, I'm not too sure if that's going to yield the type of rewards that we want. What I do want to say in terms of the regulations is, or in terms of a stick environment, or that works really well if you are enabling or changing with what's happening globally, with what we're seeing. I'm going to use another practical example, and for the longest time, our energy regulations constrained companies in terms of going out and implementing large-scale solar in the South African context. And that has now changed. So to some effect, that's changed the game a bit. And I certainly think that it's given some kind of leverage to the just transition discussions. But so when we use the term, sticks or regulations, we just have to be very careful that they actually, if it is a stick, that it actually enables the kind of action that you want, versus it being a stick and it constraining what companies want to do or try to do or want to put onto the table. And the solar being an example of that. Sure. But Belinda, I'm not sure what, I'd like to hear your take on this.
Please go ahead, Belinda.
I'll go for it. In some ways, I'm not sure, but I think there are probably two useful things to say about this, to add to what Corinne said. One is that, we try to take a stick approach in the climate change world, following Kyoto Protocol, with carbon credits and a carbon price. So the idea always was that if you were going to penalize companies, and this was the basis of the European trading scheme, right? It was the basis of it, was that companies in different countries in Europe would get penalized by their country for not limiting greenhouse gases to certain levels. And so a carbon price then emerged in the market, trading like a commodity, like oil or whatever, that had to then be better than the 40 euros a ton of carbon emission fine, or whatever it was. I think that's the right number, that was then going to accrue to the company that was emitting. So they either were going to sell and trade carbon and reduce their emissions that way at a price on the market, or they were going to get penalized through a fine. So the European trading scheme and the whole carbon price rose and collapsed. It didn't work. And I think it cost, probably created some nice jobs along the way and some skills, but it didn't last. I don't I think one needs to look at punitive measures or penalizing measures differently. I actually think in the end, like my Sasol example earlier, if they don't transition, they will penalize themselves because they will be out of jobs. They will be out of the market. They will not be a leading player in coal to liquid technologies anymore, which is, a globally leading technology. European countries want it. They don't understand it, but they want Sasol because they understand that Sasol can use that kind of technology for green hydrogen production, and they want the green hydrogen.
Right.
So, yeah.
So are we relying on market forces? Are we relying on investors deploying their capital elsewhere?
I think we need to rely on the fact that, as happened with renewable energy, 2015 was a turning point for renewable energy. It became the cheapest source of energy in the world in 2015 because supply and demand economics started to play. Right. And that's a market driver. So I think that the penalization will come from not being able to play in the game anymore because you're not transitioning, and the rest will follow. So I'm not too big on.
So then it's going to be price driven, i.e. renewables will be cheaper, and other issues such as carbon tax might actually just be secondary issues to that main issue. Thank you for that. Okay, it's a question here from Tracy. Please, can we expand on the cost of the just transition and the financing thereof? Where does it come from? Who is responsible for this? Again, is there some kind of equality between the developed world and the developing world that needs to be driven and exercised? Belinda, let me keep with you. Have you got an idea on the scale of what a just transition is going to look like beyond just the energy transition? I mean, have you properly factored in these other issues that we've been speaking about?
I don't think anyone's done a full costing, and I don't think we can, and I wouldn't waste time on it. I think what we know is that this is scale. We're talking about an industrial revolution type scale, which took over the world. It involves everybody. In the just energy transition in South Africa alone, for example, we got an 8.5 billion deal for parts of the just energy transition, but that was simply to leverage another 91 billion that's needed, right? So that 8.5 billion is nothing. It's a drop in the ocean, and that money has to come from a combination of international investment. So the Europeans have got massive targets around electric vehicles and no more fossil fuels, etc. To reach those targets, they need to put the incentives and the finances in place. Skills need to be developed. South Africa is talking about green hydrogen, but have we got the skills? Have we got the infrastructure? No. Where are we going to get that support from? We're going to get it from the people that want the green hydrogen, because those markets will lead, right? The European markets will lead on offtake. So I think that, the money's got to come from a range of places. I think national governments have to play. They have to transition their own budgeting and fiscal systems. We are working with National Treasury, for example, to think these things through. What are the implications for the South African fiscal system if local government procures more and more renewable energy and does that through private sector engagement? What does that mean? Municipal revenue models will change fundamentally. I mean, they can rely on anything between 33 and 44% on their revenue from electricity sales. So what if they're not getting it from there anymore? So the fiscal system, I think, it's a bit what I was saying about the private sector earlier. Private sector is an important implementer and public sector is an important policy maker. I think that stands, but national governments have to play in the transition, and they have to do it through through the various tools that they have at their disposal. It's hard to talk about the national fiscus in South Africa. It's in a mess. That's not a secret. So do we have the money to pay for this? Technically, probably no, but do we need to have the money to pay for it? Yes, and we can draw on it from our existing tools, grant systems, intergovernmental grant systems, the way we budget, the way we plan, the way we hold accountability, etc., etc. So yeah, I think that would be my long, short answer.
Okay, no, thank you very much. Karine, earlier we were talking about a recent report that has come out. $192 trillion, I think, was the figure that you spoke about, needs to effectively be transferred from the developed north towards the global south in terms of this transition. I'm not sure if that was specifically the energy transition or if that was more, but your viewpoints on where the financing should come from.
I really liked what Belinda said in terms of, we can't really put a figure to this. This was a report. It was an article released by Forbes today. It was a study done and published in Nature, in the Nature Sustainability Academic Journal. And they've quantified this figure. I really liked what Belinda said in terms of that we cannot put a figure to it. And I'll go back to what we said initially. We're talking about a transition. So it's really hard to put firstly, we're struggling globally to put an end date to that. Now we want to put a figure to that as well. We've discussed earlier, we know that in all likelihood we're going to overshoot this 1.5 degrees. And at the same time, we know in each of the IPCC reports that have been released, we talk about the increase in severity, the increase in the rapidness of these physical climate manifestations happening. So if we think about a figure, it's very hard to pinpoint that because there are so many variables at play. What we need to look at is a way to a continuum of supportive financing mechanisms that can drive economic resilience, social resilience in the light of these different changes. Now, there are many international funding mechanisms that one could look at, and that certainly can assist. But I, for one, believe that in terms of how we budget nationally, as Belinda alluded to, we need to start thinking from a complex system perspective in terms of how climate will address and may impact several economic sectors, and what is the requirement and how do we budget for those at the moment, and how do we need to change that, and what do we need to provide for in terms of these different variables. And so it's not about an end figure. I think it should be a continuum, and we should start with how we budget at a national level across social, across industrial policy, to start integrating these different components rather than seeing them in isolation from one another. Certainly there is an international funding role to be played, particularly when it comes to developing countries who are bearing the brunt of the economic growth that we've seen and that we've benefited from, but who didn't necessarily play a part in the Industrial Revolution to such an extent. So, and again, this is where we need to look at how is development aid being spent at the moment? Does it consider a range of different factors as it should? Are we looking at education? Are we looking at health? Are we looking at basic service delivery in a too siloed and an isolated manner? And could the solution be to start looking at these in an integrated manner and pooling these different resources and financial mechanisms in some way or another?
Okay, Belinda, thank you for that. Great insights. And also, I guess, just going to an earlier point of yours, time is pretty much of the essence. We need to start to be thinking about this straight away in terms of everything. Belinda, I can see you've got some thoughts on this.
Yeah, I do, just quickly. And Karine actually sort of started getting there with the how part. But before I even get to the how part, sort of, the number doesn't matter. It's going to be what it's going to be. But the cost of not doing.
Right.
That thought. And on the how part, there are three ways of looking at justice in a just transition, right? It's procedural, so inclusivity in decision making, which probably doesn't cost a lot. It's just about doing things very differently, and very important in unequal societies such as this one, South Africa. Distributive justice. How do we distribute the resources in society? Where do we build the skills? What about the youth that are facing 67 unemployment rates in not only this country? I mean, this is a global phenomenon, if that's the right word, risk. And then restorative justice, which is compensation for impacted groups. So you also have to accept that not everybody is going to get a benefit out of this. Some people will lose out. I think you started with that, winners and losers.
Yeah.
So we also need to think about how we distribute the resources and who we pay as compensation. Because they are definitely going to lose out, whereas others will gain. And I just wanted to end on the financial cost with those two key things.
Thank you very much for that. I can see a couple more very interesting questions have come in here, but we are slightly heading towards the end of our allocated time. I need to come back to this because there were many questions around it, just to get both of your viewpoints. Just energy transition in a country like South Africa, where we are facing energy security issues, i.e. load shedding. As one participant has said, does load shedding throw a spanner in the works in terms of our efforts on a just energy transition? Belinda, your thoughts first.
The load shedding, horrible as it might seem, or astonishing as it might seem, is probably one of the biggest opportunities we've ever had in this country. The private sector is coming to the fore, local governments are coming to the fore. There are actors playing in the energy space that we've never seen. It's unprecedented in South Africa's energy history. It also takes me, though, back to this issue that Corinne was talking about earlier of energy poverty, and who wins and who loses in this transition. The problem with load shedding and the problem with the response to load shedding. So, I'm a middle income person, or whatever you call it. I'm not a low income household. I've installed solar and batteries in my house. I've unload shedded my house, right? I've done the same in my office. My business works, my house works. There are millions of people that have got small businesses and low-income households that can't afford to do that. So we are again losing people through this transition because we're not planning and we're not seizing the opportunities that load shedding presents. So we've got those opportunities, but we're not taking the inclusive part. And the distributive justice is not happening, and that is a missed opportunity. So a good side and a not so good side to that story, but it can be, yeah. And
it's a crisis that, ironically, also is not born out of climate change. It's born out of engineering malfunctions more than anything.
That's diplomatically put.
Corinne, your thoughts on the load shedding issue here in South Africa?
I think there's a quote, or there was a book, and it was, never waste a good crisis.
Yeah.
And I agree 100% with Belinda. I think that the load shedding has been has been an incredible driver. I think it's shown it's a horrible pun, but it's shown a light in terms of the malfunctioning and deterioration of our grid, and the need for energy continuity and looking elsewhere and looking at alternatives. So I think that was critical. But agreed, again, it is the most vulnerable in our societies that are left without any options. And this goes back to what Belinda's been saying continuously. It's about planning and proactively planning for this. We've known for quite some time that our energy grid is in significant distress. We've known this, and on a municipal level, we have not planned for this at all. And we can put our houses on batteries and on different types of systems, but there are many small businesses, many communities, healthcare facilities, educational facilities, which simply cannot operate during load shedding, and we failed to plan for those proactively, and I think that the fact that we're still not coming up with proactive plans, and I'm saying this as somebody who went to a local IDP meeting a few weeks ago, the fact that we're still not able to proactively plan for these events is completely a missed opportunity, but it is also a complete injustice to communities across South Africa and wherever else there are these failures of decision making and short-term decision making.
Absolutely. Well, I hope those are good responses to the questions that came in on that. We are most unfortunately out of time. What a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much, Belinda. Thank you so much, Karine. I personally have really enjoyed the discussions that we've had over the last week on this just transition. Learned a whole lot around it. Absolutely fantastic. The input from the participants on the webinar also, thank you very, very much. Thank you for those questions. Incredibly insightful. Takeaway from my side, I guess, is that a just transition is like a very, very, very big orchestra. Many, many different parts to it, and we need many conductors, not just one conductor. So we are facing a great challenge, and we're facing a great opportunity. As Karine says, quoting, it might have been Winston Churchill, I'm not sure, but let's not let a good crisis go to waste. From our side, from the ESG Exchange, thank you to everyone. This has been recorded. It will be available on YouTube, but also just to let you know that all the questions have been recorded as well, and we will endeavor to get back to those whose questions we weren't able to address today. So on that, thank you, Belinda. Thank you, Karine. Thank you very much to the ESG Exchange and to Carolyn Chalmers as well. Thank you, and cheerio.
Thank you. Bye-bye.